My name is Kati Halfin. I'm an organizer of the panel on art in the aftermath of the Gaza conflict. Thank you very much for coming tonight to listen to our panelists and participate in the discussion we have tonight. As the name of the panel suggests, we want to focus on how war and violent conflict impact art and culture, and the personal experiences of the artists who work and create within such an environment. I believe that our discussion here will contribute to deeper understanding of usually hidden details and nuances of life and work within such complicated, tense, and hostile atmosphere. I really hope that our modest event will be one of the small, incremental steps toward the end of hostility, hatred, and violence between the people. I would like to thank Susan Ilian, my colleague, who unfortunately cannot be here tonight, but worked closely with me to organize this event. Also, I would like to thank Mark Tribe, who allowed this event happen, and I would like to introduce you Yoav Sivan, who is the moderator of the panel. Yoav Sivan, he is an Israeli journalist based in New York. Here.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Kati. Good evening, and thank you for being with us tonight. I also would like to wish happy holidays to everybody, and for those of us who celebrate today, happy Hanukkah. I'd like to thank the School of Visual Arts for hosting the event tonight as part of the Visiting Artist Lectures of the MFA Fine Arts program. Special thanks to Mark Tribe, the chair of the MFA Fine Art. Thank you, Mark. I'd like also to thank Kati Halfin for all the hard work she put into organizing the event and in making it happen. So before we start, just how many of you I don't know if you are SVA students? So, okay, the majority. So let me ask you another question. Who has been to the Middle East? Okay. Who has been to Chicago, just to get like a comparison? Okay. So, and to Queens? Okay. So now we have the picture. So we're not dealing with art in Queens and politics in Queens. We'll deal with a bit of a more problematic area, the Middle East. It's always on the news, and usually it's not quite pleasant news, but tonight we're not talking about the harsh news of the Middle East, at least not directly. We gather here to speak about culture and about the connection between art and politics. So the discussion tonight we have 3 parts, more or less. We'll get to know our panelists, and then afterwards we'll open the debate for discussion. I'll ask a few questions to all of the participants, and we'll hopefully have a lively debate here. And we'll end with a dialogue with the audience. So we'll start. I'll introduce you first to Eli Barak. Oh, there are images. This is the multimedia part of the evening. Eli is a multidisciplinary artist. He works with mixed media installation, sculpture, and performance. He uses recycled materials in diverse surroundings. Eli engages with familiar cultural images in diverse spaces, creating a dialogue with curatorial practices. His subject is individual and cultural identity. He created group exhibitions, and his works can be found in international collections. He received his BFA in Israel from HaMidrasha School of Art, and he also studied graphic design at NYU. He participated in the 2010 Israel Biennale, as well as in solo and group exhibitions in galleries in Israel. And he's recipient of the Excellence Award in Fine Arts from the American Israel Cultural Foundation. So Eli, I will to get to know you better, let me ask you a question. Some of your work deal with the Mizrahi identity in Israel. Could you please tell us a bit, explain to us what is this Mizrahi identity and what is your art has to do with that?
Okay, so when I was trying to even explain to Katya how I view myself as an Israeli, it was really complicated. Up until the moment we actually got into this auditorium tonight, it was kind of tricky to explain how I define myself, because I see myself especially when American audience or people ask me, who are you? Of course I say I'm Israeli, but if I want to be more specific about my ethnicity or my identity, I say I am Jewish of Arab descent, because I think looking backwards to where my ancestors came from to Israel, all of them, without exclusion, came from Arab countries, Morocco, Egypt, Syria. So they're all Arab descent, but by the fact that they just moved to Israel, did this migration, they were expected to leave behind their cultural baggage, their cultural ethnicity, and to take upon themselves this assimilated Israeli identity. So when I look backwards, I try to reverse my gaze. I try to kind of reclaim something that is left behind, something that I'm expected to forget, something that is not part of how people define themselves in Israel. Because like there is this barrier, I guess. So that's why I refer to when I mean Mizrahi. So Mizrahi is a generalized name for an ethnic group of people, but that are not the same group, that came from all over the Middle East. That's what it really is supposed to represent.
And your work, how do you,
So in my work, in my recent work, I try to get this voice that is influenced or is present within me of Arab identity to come out, like on a literal level, but also on a metaphoric level. So I sing in some of my performances songs that are influenced mainly from Arab music. So it's Musica Mizrahit, which is music that is influenced by Arab or Middle East songs and music, and I bring it into my performances. It's there. That's how it sneaks in as a subcontext and a context.
Thank you, Eli. Our next panelist is Ridwan Adami. He was born in New York, but he's a Syrian-American filmmaker and photographer. He has done a number of photos and portraits that speak on the Palestinian plight, featuring Palestinian artists, writers, and other creative voices. He visited Palestine with the Islamic Relief USA, where he served as a creative director. He documented their humanitarian work as well as the issues Palestinians deal with in the West Bank through photos and video. And he's also heading Reed's Design, which is a creative agency. So I want to ask you, Ridwan, can you tell us a bit about the project that you did in Palestine? What made you do it? You did it during a visit to the place. to what extent, what is the role of an artist of visiting a place rather than perhaps living in the place?
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for having me. Well, a lot of this stuff that you're seeing here is a lot of my commercial work that before kind of finding my identity, I was, working a lot in the music industry and in the film industry, and then getting to know other Arabs, other Muslims that are coming up in the same identity, trying to find your identity of who you are and how to represent yourself. So you kind of gravitate towards people that you know and people that you can relate to and people who are dealing with the same ideas as you are and the same difficulty as you are. So that was my first connection to Palestine, whereas dealing with other Arabs growing up here in America, kind of trying to find yourself, combining both sides to make a third thing that isn't really here nor there. What I ended up doing was I took a position at Islamic Relief USA, a nonprofit humanitarian organization, as their creative director. So actually getting to document the humanitarian side. So it was one end of my work is the entertainment end and the art end, and the other end was humanitarian work. And then it was bridging those together to kind of tell stories, really. Tell stories of people that we normally don't see, or we normally don't hear about, or we don't get to hear the truth about. So to search for that truth by telling their stories, by going and documenting the place and the people, and kind of communicating with the people directly to have them tell their story, and then bring that back here where people don't necessarily have that connection. So some of this stuff is in Jerusalem and the West Bank. And it's documenting a lot of the humanitarian work that we do in the organization, but also bridging that side with art to kind of tell people stories and express what their plight is.
Thank you. Next, Brandy Bajalia is a multidisciplinary artist working primarily in the ephemeral installation and socially engaged performances. She often deals with her own complicated identity as a second-generation Palestinian American woman who grew up in the Deep South. Her projects have recently involved collaborative dialogue about issues such as the Gaza conflict while building a float made of flowers, utilizing art as both a form of catharsis and grounds for discussion. She was born in Alabama, but now she lives here in New York, and I would like to ask you, Brandy, you are an American, you were born here, but your work often deals with memory and your family history. Is distance, you find, a power or rather a limitation?
I don't think it's a limitation. I think it's a different perspective. For a really long time, I sort of wished that I had been able to visit Ramallah, which is where my grandmother is from, to sort of better understand the culture of my family and sort of what I've been exposed to my entire life. But I actually think, of course I would still like to visit, but I actually think that my understanding of it is sort of interesting because I have the sort of complicated part of being from Birmingham, Alabama, which has its own history. And then also growing up in a family that spoke Arabic around me and sort of exposed me to traditions that none of my friends were aware of. So I think I spent a lot of my life trying to understand what that meant and where I fit in. So I wouldn't say it's a limitation. I think it's, for me, I think it makes me someone who's really interested in the culture that I'm tied to, and then also like various other cultures as well, and seeing where, what it means to be from one place and to be exposed to an entirely different culture at the same time.
Thank you. Next, we have Nouri Ilashi, a writer here in New York. She has an MFA in creative writing from the New School, and she's written for McSweeney's, the Huffington Post, the Fort Worth Star Telegram, and other publications. She received the Myborn Literary Nonfiction Prize. She's an advocate for her father. She will tell us more about that, for which she visits university campuses, among them Yale, Columbia, Brown, NYU. And she's now writing a memoir about her family. Noor, let me ask you, how does art help address your personal family history?
Thank you for introducing me. I wanted to start by reading an excerpt of my memoir, and I think that is going to be the beginning of the answer to your question. And it starts off like this. My family visited my father for the first time about a week after he entered the medium security prison in Seagoville, Texas. By the time I finally saw him, I felt like I'd finished a marathon. I parked the van and reminded my mother and siblings that our visitation time will end in 2 hours, so we hurried down the long cement pathway, glanced up at the towering barbed wire fence, entered through glass double doors, and filled out several sign-in sheets stating that we did not possess drugs or weapons. And we took off our shoes and placed our clear plastic bags of dollars and coins on the counter, walking through the metal detector in 5-second intervals. And then we stuck out our hands for a guard to stamp with clear ink, when suddenly a heavy gray door slid open. So we walked into the trap, prison lingo for the small area designed for you to place your fists under an ultraviolet light, which we did until the guard behind the glass window nodded and flipped the switch that opened the second door. And finally, we were in the visitation room, which reeked of sweat and wet rags, and after handing the forms to the man sitting at the front, I saw several connected rows of seats, chairs that were not for us, since our only contact with my father was going to take place behind a plexiglass wall. So we waited for him in a bright lit room while my brothers wandered out to buy chips, chewy candy, and soda from the vending machines, food that's not good for them. Meanwhile, my younger brother started reading from pages of a ripped book and assembled a few pieces of a well-worn puzzle. And after 30 minutes of waiting, we heard someone shuffling behind the door at the other side of the glass enclosure. And at last, my father entered the room, but his hands were still behind his back. His hands were still handcuffed. That is, until he squatted with his back against the door, his arms through a slot next to the knob, and allowed a guard to use a special key to detach his arms, causing my father to rub the pink imprints around his wrists, sigh, and sit down. So I start to read this because this was like an experimental piece of literature. It was one paragraph and it was one sentence. And I was inspired by Gay Talese, who is like one of the grandfathers of literary nonfiction. And I could talk about my story. I could, talk about it all I want, but it's not going to be the same as transforming it into something creative and beautiful that everyone can kind of not necessarily relate to, but just very clearly visualize and understand. And I have long believed in the power of art as being a very, very powerful tool of narrative storytelling. And so this is why I've chosen this memoir to tell the story. And you mentioned that I went to the New School. While I was at the New School, I actually started an organization called Project Palestine. And I put together several programs that were basically just meant to illustrate the human condition, mainly concerning the Palestinian population through different means of arts, music, film, literature, poetry. So I have long believed of art as a very powerful tool to convey a story and to convey a message.
Thank you. As we have Adi Gold, who is the New York bureau chief of Yediot Acharonot, Israel's largest newspaper. He was head of the culture department at Yediot and edited the newspaper's culture supplement. His writings were also published in American magazines such as the Daily Forward and Tablet magazine. He was the Knight Wallace Fellow at the University of Michigan. So Adi, I would like to ask you about, we often talk about here Israeli identity, Palestinian identity, Arab identity. There's so many complicated identities, so I'd like to take actually a case that is very recent, a movie which was released just now in Israel called Dancing Arabs, based on a book by Said Kashua. Perhaps could you tell us a bit about...
Yeah, I think that this case tells a lot regarding what's going on in Israel these days. This movie was scheduled to open the last Jerusalem Film Festival in July, and then started actually the last war between the last war in Gaza. So the producers actually decided not to screen this movie in Jerusalem due to the war, and especially due to the fact that they thought it's not a great timing for this kind of a movie that has this name, this headline, Dancing Arabs in Israel. And the topic of the movie is the challenges of being Israeli Arab living in Israel, in Israeli Jewish area and hood. So they actually postponed the release of the movie. It was opened in Israel just last month. It became a big success. So the meaning of it is that the people in Israel are not really afraid from this kind of movies. It's a very touching, lovely, sensitive movie. So I guess that when it comes soon to New York, it will be a great timing to see it.
Thank you. Now let's move to the second part of our evening. We start with the big events that we're all familiar with, the Arab Spring and Operation Protective Edge. These are events that made obviously headlines here in New York. But we're talking about here about culture, about art. So let me ask our panelists, what was the effect of those big political events? What was the effect on culture? What was the effect on art? What was the effect on Israeli culture? What was the effect on Palestinian culture? And to make it more personal, how did you, as artists, experience those events? Did they make you, did they encourage you to engage with those topics, or rather they were such great moments, so you wanted to actually to create a distance? So we'll start with Eli.
So when the Arab Spring first was showing up, starting, I think in Israel, it was received in mixed feelings. Like a lot of people were expecting, like the rest of the world was expecting, okay, democracy is coming and it's going to just cause good things, and it's like, but then when people were realizing that it's, so there's this ambivalent relation to this topic, because there is, I think, within the Israeli society, an overall fear of from the rise of Islam, and it looked at the beginning like things are getting out of control, and there was a lot of fear. People did not really know how to react to it, and it was kind of the Israeli, the typical Israeli, if we can even say that, was sitting on the fence waiting for things to kind of turn this way or the other, and there was a lot of fear, and there was, for me, it was a chance to real positive change, and I think the way things turned to be, it kept me surprised. At the same time, we all know that there's some sort of like hidden hands behind the scenes pulling. America has influence on what was going on, and I'm not saying conspiracy, but there is a strong relationship between the Mubarak regime and the Egyptian regime and America. So it was like, it was complex.
And you as an artist, what?
Me as an artist, you talk about the Arab Spring, or you go down to the...
So let me
conflict
make
in Gaza?
just one qualification. Arab Spring was the demonstration that toppled regimes throughout the Middle East, and Operation Protective Edge can be it's the Israeli name actually, referring to the bloodshed in Gaza last summer. So we're talking about more generally about the events throughout the Middle East, and specifically the last confrontation between Israel and the Palestinians last summer.
So in regards to the last conflict, I think it's like, okay, so there's this tendency to make everything the same thing, where I actually think it's all series of different events. They all come from maybe similar notion, the attempt to change regime and to cause an uprise or awareness of general public. I separate what happens between Israel and the Palestinians in the last conflict and what happened in other parts, and I know it's related, but it's not such a direct connection that I make. I think that it was like very, very heartbreaking to see what was going on, and for many Israelis, every kind of conflicts like that kind of raises the barrier. It raises the cultural barrier between the two sides, if you can call it that. I think it functions also on a practical level, that you have more fences, you have more security measurement that capture people, that limits people's ability and mobility to live the normal lives, but it also kind of make the other side less apparent and less accessible, and in that way it kind of puts him behind bars, and instead of coming closer together and then possibly having a change from the people, you get the people more distant and more apart. So that part is kind of really, really heartbreaking for me as somebody who wants to see the other side, to live with the other side.
So let me now direct the question to Randy, please.
Sure. In terms of Operation Protective Edge, for me personally, I was, watching the news from here, and I would agree with Ellie that it was incredibly heartbreaking to watch it. And I found myself thinking constantly about, sort of the implications of what was happening there and how it was progressively getting worse. And I thought about how important it was for me as an individual to sort of try to understand it the best that I could from the United States, and through like these various filters, through my family, through media. And so I guess all I can say personally, that as an artist, it made me, it definitely made me want to address the issue in my own sort of way, which was through this project. I felt it was important for it to become a discussion that people felt like they could start having. It's a difficult thing to talk about. It's sad, it's horrible, and scary on both ends. And I think that it was important for me to try to start that discussion in like the way that I knew how to do that, which was through art. So I guess that's what I can say about it personally. That I think I think it's really sad.
So is sadness a power in art, or
well, I
how would you
think
say it? How do you see it?
I mean, I think that like I said, I think it made me realize that I had to, you know, really start thinking about what this means for everyone, not just for people in the Middle East and all the people that are directly affected by that, but what that means for us as Americans, and you know, that it's something that we need to be following and we need to care about. But as an artist, I think, and as someone that's, you know, Palestinian American, that's really trying to still figure out what that means, I felt like it was important for me to kind of dig into that and to also see different viewpoints. That was really why I even decided to start this project, is I wanted to hear what other people had to say about what happened this summer. And also what, if there's any solutions, what are they, and how can something like this be resolved, something that's been happening for so long. So I guess for me it was sort of like, it felt like it was my responsibility to understand it the best that I possibly could as an American.
Ridwan, please.
So for me, the Arab Spring was definitely interesting because I was in Egypt right afterwards. I was in Egypt documenting the people, and we were in Tahrir Square, and you could feel the energy of the people being really electric and really hopeful. There was a general sense of hope that things were going to be different, and then the outlook. The young people were always saying, you know, look what we've done, and the old people said, well, we've had our neck stepped on for 30 years, so. And then the young people would say, well, you didn't do anything about it, we did. So there was this energy in the people that had hope. For myself, directly, Syria, I mean, it's still going on now. The Arab Spring hasn't ended. It's turned into winter and spring and summer and winter again, back to spring. And it's still happening. So that hasn't ended. So we'll see how that plays out as it directly relates. As far as the dealing with artists in the Arab Spring and dealing with a lot of artists that I've met, in any revolution, there's always art that relates to the revolution. In any movement, there's always art that relates to the movement, that kind of expresses what other people want to express but can't really say. So it's kind of the artist's job to do that. And sometimes we think it's kind of silly. So, for example, the last siege in Gaza, a couple of these images were created. One was created on the day of the ceasefire. One was created during the beginning of it. And it's created from a position of almost feeling helpless and hopeless because you can't do anything, and we're over here and we're in America, and it's kind of silly to be able to think that me taking a picture will actually do anything for anyone, or me creating art. But then you realize that when you create something that's speaking to what other people are feeling or what they want to hear or what they want to say, but they don't have the means to articulate it, and you're articulating it for them in some way, I think that's the power of art, is being able to help people who are generally weak feel strong, or feel voiceless have a voice, or say something that they're pushing for, or they don't feel that their voice is being heard. And then art, I believe, plays that role in the ability to say things and do things for people that can't do that normally, or don't know how to, and we don't know how to. I think as artists, a lot of the time, it's kind of where part of that is figuring that out, and figuring out the journey, and figuring out what that voice is and what that message is that you're trying to get across. And for me, honestly, it's truth, it's hope, it's those kind of things for all.
Thank you. Noor?
I jumped right into the excerpt that I realized I didn't even really explain what I was talking about. So I wanted to just quickly do that so that everyone understands and is on the same page. First and foremost, I wanted to say that I have lost my place. Okay. I'm the American-born daughter of Palestinian immigrants, and I wanted to summarize quickly the story so you know what I'm talking about and not be so lost. And my father immigrated to this country in the late 70s, and about 10 years later started a charity. And it became the largest Muslim charity in the country, and it was providing humanitarian aid to Palestinians in the form of food, medical supplies, so on and so forth. And then about 3 months after 9/11, the Bush administration shut down the charity, among other charities, and my father went through about a decade of raids and arrests and trials. And after several, like there was a mistrial and another retrial, he received all guilty verdicts, and he was sentenced to 65 years in prison for basically providing humanitarian aid to Palestinians. And it was, so I could talk to you more about the story afterwards. I don't want to spend too much time talking about that, since that's not the focus here. But basically, to answer your question specifically about like the connection between politics and art, I'd like to kind of shift that to justice and art, because my personal experience with politics isn't what my family and my father has experienced is a grand injustice. And the quote that keeps coming to mind is to quote or to paraphrase Harvard University professor Elaine Scarry. She says, "Beauty is an aid to justice." And she's argued that sometimes when we talk about beauty, which in this case is art, we're talking about the response that it evokes in a viewer. One undergoes what philosopher Iris Murdoch has referred to as the unselfing in the presence of something beautiful. And then Scarry continues to say that beauty, whether in the form of a poem, a book, a memoir, a photograph, videos, it makes humans feel marginal and obsolete, while at the same time simultaneously putting us in a state of acute pleasure. So it really raises our guards down, all of, especially like the heated topic of Palestine and Israel, it raises all of our guards down, all of, what the politicians are speaking of, and what, the people in the countries that get really, really heated up, the subjects, all of that goes down, and suddenly, we're all at the same level, looking at the same thing. So this is where I feel it's very powerful. Now, specifically regarding this Arab Spring, and again, I'm tying all of this to my specific experience and my story and the story of my father. And while all of this has happened, the Arab Spring, my father has been incarcerated. Same with the latest Gaza, bombings and all of that. My father was incarcerated during that point in time as well. And a lot of these incidents, specifically what happens in Palestine, there was Operation Cast Lead in 2009. It really sort of takes me back to the reason why my father started this charity in the first place, and that is that he wanted to provide humanitarian aid to a group of people who were in need and where there was obvious humanitarian need. And so, he speaks to me from prison through letters, through 15-minute pre-scheduled phone calls, and my response, well, before I go there, his response to all of these things has been exactly the same response that it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. It is the same response that has driven him to start this charity. He's a humanitarian soul. He does not stand silent to the face of injustice. And so he has written me beautiful passages, and I wish I could pull one up. Maybe if I can find it, I'll read it to you. But again, taking all of this, which covers like very despondent, like kind of depressing things that are going on in the world, and then just, again, transforming it, using this memoir that I hope will reach a wide, broad group of people. I think this is one of the most powerful ways to convey the story. So yes.
Adi?
Yeah, my perspective regarding the Arab Spring is just from this point that there is such a huge wall between Israel and neighbors. I mean, Israel is widely open from culture and artists from all around the world, Japanese, Italian, German, whatever. And I think that the Israeli public doesn't really know anything, and I mean anything, regarding artists from the Middle East, from Egypt or Syria or any other neighbor. Regarding the last Gaza war, so I think that it's too early to understand how large was the influence of it on the Israeli culture. But you can find the change, the huge change in TV and radio. I mean, in this kind of war days, and in this case it took long, for months, you can just hear sad songs on the Israeli radio in all of the channels. And in the 3 main TV channels, the only thing that you will find is just news. I mean, no other programs at all, just news and news for 24 hours a day. So I think that when you have this kind of environment in your place, you can feel how deep was the influence just within a time. And I guess that within some years, we'll find, you know, how deeply changed the Israeli scene.
Just wanted to make a last comment about beauty, aesthetic, and the role of an artist saying something about the conflict. I feel like this is something I didn't say, so I felt like I need to add that I think mainly for fine artists, it functions as a tricky thing to do. I think I was active during the war, against the war, but at the same time, I didn't want it to sneak into my art, because political content in my art felt to me like propaganda. So, and I think this word plays a key role, what you don't want to get yourself into.
So let me ask you, so let's go to the next question, ask you, we talk a lot about politics and art. So what exactly is your view about the connection between politics and art? Is there, you can also, any of you, if you want to mention, you can tell us about some political artist, if you want to mention, who do you think is a good example of somebody who successfully did political art, that we can, you know, learn from it, or that you have learned from him or her? So Eli, please.
For me, the connection, the immediate connection maybe between politics and art is complex. I think that you can have political content in successful art piece, but it's a challenge to start with, and it takes a lot not to get to the trap that it's flat, and instead of enriching what it is that you're saying, it's silencing. It's like, okay, it's flat, you know. It's like the channel could be very easily flattened. But it could open. But it definitely can open a door for a very rich reading. But it's a really tricky relationships that I have with the political content. It's not that I haven't seen anything that was beyond, but it takes a skill of a virtuoso to actually manage or pull off a trick like that.
Okay, Brenda, please.
I think that I would agree that it's difficult to make political art, but I don't know that I think it's any more difficult than making any art. I think that there are plenty of artists that have worked with really political content and have done it successfully. An artist that I have been looking at for years now, who I love, is Alfredo Yar, and he has made a lot of really political work. And I think what makes his work successful is like sort of the subtlety of a lot of it. I think it's like there's a piece he did called "The Cloud," which is one of the first pieces I ever saw of his, where he, it's a performance project where he releases balloons on each side of the Mexico-USA border. And there's violinists on each side, and there's a group of people on each side. And it's a really simple project, but I feel like political art is successful when it creates room for viewers to think about an issue, but it doesn't push the opinions of the artist. I think it gets a little cliche and maybe not quite as successful when it's really straightforward and aggressive. So maybe I think that it's sort of about the way the artist positions themselves in making the work. Yeah.
Thank you. Please.
I mean, for me, I don't think you can really separate it. For somebody who's perhaps a Palestinian there who's dealing with it, if an artist, you look at some of the artists, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the art where they took the images of the smoke and they superimposed people's faces in the smoke of burning buildings or things like that. That's what that artist was experiencing. I think her name was her name slips my memory right now, but it's a Palestinian artist who created images, basically painting on top of images of buildings being burned and buildings in the smoke. She put faces of people and that's the reality. That's the reality of the people that they're dealing with. So you can't really separate the two when that's the reality. When you talk to people in Palestine, you can't have a conversation without it somehow getting political at some point, because that's the reality of their life. So as an artist, you're creating from your reality. You're creating from what you live and from what you experience. So I think it is difficult to kind of separate it for somebody who's in the situation. To create something that is completely, unrelated and has no influence, your environment and your situation influences your work. So I think for a lot of Palestinians, and I would imagine for Israelis as well, that situation, like you're saying, the TV and radio changed, and so people's mentality changes, people's thought process changes in how they create. It's your environment. So I think it heavily affects, and trying to separate the two, is kind of impossible.
I've kind of addressed the question, but I want to really focus in on like where I've seen this successful in the past, or currently. First and foremost, this is a drawing of my father. It was done by an inmate. I just wanted to point it out, and I think it's very powerful. I could tell you my father, this was actually while he sat in solitary confinement for some period of time, and he stayed for 23 hours a day. I could tell you about it, and it could probably be effective, but again, visual art, image, really puts things right into perspective and helps you visualize what exactly is happening there. So I'm of the belief that, a song has helped bring down apartheid in South Africa. It's happened many times in the past, and it's proven to be successful. Currently what's happening is there's a few people come to mind. Layla al-Haddad. I don't know how many of you guys know her, Layla al-Haddad. She writes a blog called a mother in Gaza, or a mother from Gaza. But she, during Operation Cast Lead, she actually ended up she's a mother with 2 kids, and she wrote this blog. She used the power of the narrative story to convey something, and I think it was very effective. If you haven't checked out her blog, check it out. Invincible. She's an Israeli hip-hop artist. How many of you guys have heard of her? Yeah, she's amazing. I actually invited her to perform at the New School a few years ago, and she's I think has been doing very well, has her own record label, and she's, again, an Israeli-born artist who who basically raps about the injustice that's happening not only in Palestine but all over the world, and she does a really, really amazing job. There's a filmmaker, and his name escapes me, but there's a film that basically illustrates what is happening specifically with the checkpoints in the West Bank and Gaza, which are no longer there, but when they were there, using a film, which I thought was really, really creative. But this is the film. It wasn't just a documentary about Palestine. No, it was a documentary about the Palestinian soccer team. So I thought, wow, that's really creative, because the Palestinian soccer team, who knew there was one? Yes, there is. But they, basically, the soccer team itself had a lot of difficulties moving around, because obviously a lot of them, some of them didn't have, I'd encourage you to watch the film, but some of them didn't actually have the papers that would allow them to move from one part of the country to the other. So again, these are very powerful, effective means of art that I believe have been successful in illustrating a certain point.
Yeah, I think that there are no real rules for this connection between politics and art. There is no real recipe, but I do feel that where the propaganda lives, the art totally dies, and so you should find the right balance between them. And again, it's case by case. I can tell you that one of the only stories regarding art in Israel in the very last months were regarding this young artist that shot herself put on the Israeli flag. And it was a very big, sensational story in Israel with many feedbacks, and but after all, it felt as a post in Facebook, not as a real art. And I still feel that it's like the huge gap between a great song of the Ramones and an awful punk song. So again, I think that this is the thing, case by case, and this to find the right combination between art and your attitude.
I will start now with you, Adi. Since we meet Middle East art, culture, often through the context of politics, I would like to ask you whether that context is helpful or rather hindrance to other types of art. There's many ways to ask this question. Let me give you a few formulations. So, is political art more authentic? Is it because of politics we get from the Middle East more authentic kind of art that we can find from other places where are perhaps less political? Is it perhaps better, more interesting, more intriguing, more relevant? We hear it more because we have here the opportunity. We're talking about here about art in the Middle East and politics. Perhaps if not, we wouldn't have a panel like that about other places. Or rather, we have, because of that, we have perhaps more attention, but also more cliches, more, cheaper kinds of art. It's perhaps easier to make art in the Middle East because of politics, people will listen to us, people will hear us, right? So how do you find it? How is politics really, does it make art great or actually perhaps mediocre.
If I'll have to talk about the Israeli culture, so I think that first of all, many Israeli artists are truly afraid to talk or to write or to create anything regarding politics, because they do afraid to have this kind of content that they will feel that will be kind of threat on their audience. So I don't think that after all, if you are counting let's say the last 30 years in Israel, you can find so many artists that are truly political. On the same time, I can tell you that in some of the cases when people are doing this kind of stuff, it makes them definitely superficial, and it doesn't make their arts much better. The last example that I can give is a very talented Israeli singer and writer named Amir Benayoun, which I thought was really sensitive and interesting, and a guy that have this combination between East and West and the current music. So he started writing in the very last years more and more politics stuff, and it's just not good. You know, it's just not at the very same level that he wrote before. I don't know if it's anything regarding politics, but again, it's this thing that he didn't find the right combination, the right balance between his art and politics.
Thank you. Nora?
I think that politics is a turnoff for a lot of people. Just to hear the word politics, probably not for a lot of you sitting here, but I'm pretty sure a lot of New Yorkers, a lot of Americans, a lot of people in the world, they would rather not know what's happening. I mean, it's not like people are purposefully sort of against or pro what's happening. Most people would rather just not know. I think the most effective kind of art covering something political is that an art that is not specifically like in your face, and one that is not like very clearly. I think this is where subtlety is power, in other words. And there was something, I'm sorry, is it okay if I read another excerpt? Yeah, my iPad turned off. In any case, I think where it is most effective is where subtlety comes in. And what I was going to read is actually, and I can just tell you about it. I start off by saying that my father learned yoga and Pilates in prison. And then I go on, basically, we're in a visitation room, and there's a plexiglass wall, and he's behind it, and he's doing every manner yoga pose you can imagine. He starts off, and he breathes in, and he stretches, and it goes on for a few pages, and by the end of it, you're like, okay, what is this really about? But again, I think it says a lot, and it was that passage that Dave Eggers, Pulitzer Prize-winning writer and amazing soul, read that passage and said, like, this is why we want to publish you in McSweeney's. And this is where I feel like subtlety is power. Is political art intriguing? Yes. In my view, it is most intriguing when it is not so in your face.
Thank you. Ridwan, please.
I think a lot of my peers have tried to almost separate themselves from you're that Arab rapper who only talks about this problem or that problem, or you almost get pigeonholed into things when people assume you are this or that, or what people like to put you in categories and place you into boxes because it's easy and it's neat. You're the Palestinian daughter of a guy who's in prison, so therefore you must have a very specific opinion about everything. So people like to do that, and as an artist, it's kind of difficult sometimes to step away from that, to kind of move away from that and kind of develop your own stuff that has truth to it and has, honesty to what your opinion is, not because you are an Arab, therefore you must think A, B, C, D, and you must react these ways to it. I think in my case personally, a lot of my stuff is not subtle. I think because at this stage in the game, at least for me, I'm not as refined to be not subtle. I don't think as a community we're not that refined yet to be not subtle. I think right now where we're at that baby stage where we just want to be heard. When a baby their first thing is to scream and to yell and to shout and those kind of things, because that's how you get somebody's attention. And that's kind of where I feel we're at as Arab artists. Because, if you feel ignored, you're going to do what you can to get people's attention onto you. If you feel that your situation is ignored, you're going to do what you can to get people's eyes on you. Once that happens, I think then you can start to refine things to kind of express things more nuanced. A person's art when they're 18 years old is not the same when they're 25, is not the same when they first have a child, is not the same when they're 40. So that changes. And in any genre, the art itself changes as it grows and it ages. And I think art being widely viewed from the region, it's still pretty young due to social media and due to all those things. We're all seeing a lot more from everything. So we're all just getting used to being able to see these things from the people we like to put in boxes.
Sorry if I sound like a broken record, but I guess, again, I do think that I would agree that I think, like, subtlety in making work that's pretty complicated to approach really helps. I personally avoid being categorized as much as possible. As an artist, I think I make a lot of different things, and that has a lot to do with sort of not wanting to be pigeonholed as someone that makes work only about, coming from, sort of two different cultures, like understanding two different cultures and also trying to figure out what that means. But I guess I think that, I think political art is successful when there is room to view it and to create a conversation about the issue. And that's sort of where I see it being successful. Yeah, that's it.
I think it's interesting to think about this topic in relation to popular culture, mainstream, what you're allowed to say within the margins, and where I'm putting myself and the music I'm bringing into my pieces is it's a retake on how it was rejected from the Israeli mainstream. This sort of music that was labeled as, this is too Arab for the radio, this is too Arab for mainstream. You're not wanted here. Like, that was the official tone addressed to this sort of music. So for me, I think it's laying sometimes materials without saying. Sometimes it's a way to get without saying exactly what it's supposed to make the audience feel, what it's supposed to make the audience see. They need to see for themselves. They need to seek. They need to dig into the layers that you put in front of them. And I think that's a more interesting way of how it should be, or maybe it's a one way of how it can exist within the relationship of viewer and an artist. Or yeah.
One quick note, because he was talking directly to me, and I would like to respond to that. So I'm just kidding. I think there's something about the refinement of the message, And I think that there's a lot of power behind the approach. And I think it's proven to be effective time and time again. And I think that I feel turned off when someone yells at me. I want to walk away. Perhaps it works with the people who actually know about what's happening. You could, as they say, preach to the choir, or, you know, continue to rage about the struggle to a group of people who know what's happening. But at the end of the day, if you want to sort of inspire a more wide range public outcry, or inspire outrage from a wider range of people who may not actually know not even a single minute thing about the subject in which you are speaking, I personally believe that the more effective approach is one that is one that leaves room for interpretation, and one that sort of just lays out the bare facts. It could be through a spoken word artist. I think that is a very powerful way of telling a story. Suhair Hamad, Palestinian American, was on Def Poetry Jam and became widely known. And she had a very specific way in which she relayed the story that I found was very effective and very powerful.
Thank you. Our last question before we open the debate. Let's look at politics and culture from the perspective of politics, and we'll talk about the boycotts and the calls for a boycott on Israeli institutions. Those calls are not new. There have been here for very many years and raised by many organizations, mostly in the United States, also in Europe. In the last few years, we've heard a lot about the BDS movement that has been calling for this focus more on academics and artists, and trying to persuade them to boycott Israeli institutions. So I would like to ask you, under what circumstances do you think that a cultural boycott is a reasonable strategy? Eli.
Okay, so for me it's a really hardcore matter, because I'm Israeli and I have family, friends, loved ones in Israel, and I think that the idea of boycott is going to put Israeli in general, Israeli people, in a spot that they cannot. It's like, okay, so it's like throwing away the baby with the water, and it's going to put many Israeli in a position that they. When I think of it, I don't think of it just of how it will affect my friends and people who I know. I think how it will affect the whole region. And maybe when people think of Israelis, they think of one identity, one ethnicity, but it's basically, it's almost like something inseparable that contains Arab Israelis, Palestinian, Arab Israelis, other ethnicity. So it's like boycotting Israel is not going to help the situation. I have a strong feeling that it's going to escalate the situation. But one thing that maybe I think that I can give as a credit or a chance for it to actually exist as a leverage, once it's an actual thing that threatens Israel, it might kind of create this pushback from within the politics, from within the society, to respond, to react to a situation that is kind of been static for too long, and people are desperate for a change, and nothing is really happening. So I think if an actual boycott will take place, it will be a terrible idea, because I think it's like, basically I have a feeling that it's a very racist idea. Maybe other people from the panel or in the whole in the auditorium will disagree with me, but I think it's kind of, it creates another way of barrier between what could be said and what could not be said.
I've thought about this question a lot, and I honestly, I don't have an answer, but I will say that I think it has the potential to serve as like another form of prejudice that makes me really uncomfortable. So I would say that I don't think that cultural boycott is a good strategy at all. I'd like to hear what others think about that, but I just can't, I can't foresee that making the situation better. You know, I'm all for justice. I'm all for there being peace. But I get the feeling that a boycott isn't going to do that. So I would say that I don't think it's a good strategy.
Thank you.
I think for me it's important to be able to separate an economical boycott versus a cultural boycott. I think a cultural boycott, a lot of people can agree on. If you're trying to suppress a culture and you're trying to, you know, put down somebody's identity, that's not necessarily a good thing. But if you're trying to affect a policy through economic means, I think that's the all-American way. I mean, the American way is to affect things in the number one way that people care about, and that's through money. Be it supporting things or not supporting things. I think we speak loudest with our dollar, and I think that's my take on that.
Noor, please.
I think boycott in general, I don't think is a racist strategy. I think it's been very effective in the past, specifically in the case of the South African apartheid movement. As far as cultural boycott versus other kinds of boycotts, the only thing that I would boycott, whether it is any Israeli good, Palestinian good, any American good, any whatever good, is one that supports violence and killing.
I do think that boycotting is terrible, and it doesn't really matter if it's Israel, North Korea, Iran, whatever. If we have to think about cultural boycotting, so I think that it's a big miss. And if we are taking, for example, an artist like Elvis Costello that canceled his concert in Israel a few years ago, so I think that it was a big chance for him to go to Israel and to say what he thinks and to talk about the real problems. And I think that in this matter, it didn't make this necessary difference between the government and the public, the real people.
Thank you. This is a good point, I think, to open the debate here. Questions from the audience?
Yeah, I think comedy is huge because it allows you to say things that normally you wouldn't say, and it's a joke, haha. And you know, so you can say comedians tend to get away with a lot more than a lot of other people get away with because it's under the guise of comedy. So satire is a huge thing to be able to say a lot of things that a lot of people, you know, don't normally say or wouldn't normally listen to, you know, from a different perspective. But it presented as a comedy, you know, a lot of my friends are Arab comedians, Saeed Durra, Moammer, Dino Badallah, that whole, they're using comedy to tell their people's story in a different way.
I think, I don't know if this was directed towards everyone or just, humor I think is a very powerful tool, and it has to be done right, I think, for it to be effective, obviously, but there are certain points in general, but specifically in my story, where things are just so hysterical that they're sort of beyond funny, but you sort of have to laugh at them. One time when we visited my father, we we got, like, as we neared the prison, there was an intersection, and you can't even make this up, called Justice Drive and Prison Road. And so I got down and I started taking photos, and I was really excited that I captured the moment and, for what it was. And then, as we went, parked our car, went inside the lobby of the prison, I was approached by one of the guards saying that we actually, the man in the tower watched you take photos. We're going to have to follow you to your car where your phone is. You're going to have to delete the pictures in front. And I thought, okay. And so, like, these were two, like, characters of people, like, who with, like, southern accents like this, and, they followed me all the way to the car, and they made sure I deleted every single photo. But, like, you can't even make this up. There are certain things that happen, and I think that kind of humor just, again, brings the guard down and really puts things into perspective.
I think that for me, humor is a backdoor to the audience. Instead of like saying things from here, it's like I'm getting off the stage, sneaking to your back, sitting next to you, and whispering to you something that you would not be confronted with, or if you are confronted with, you immediately raise your guards. So I think, like, I deal with sometimes with like content that is so from myself, about my identity, that is so heartbreaking. And my way for me to, even as a human being, not necessarily as an artist, is just it's either cry or laugh about it. But so I choose to kind of make fun of it and live with it. It's a very it contains like a survival mechanism.
I think normalization can be a very dangerous thing. I believe that I have provided the only story that I know to be true. I would be interested in hearing the non-Arab version of that answer. I don't know.
I mean, just speaking from, talking with artists who are there. When in Ramallah, I had a dinner one time where it was just basically a circle of artists in Ramallah. And the conversation, part of it is about art, but part of it was just about what they're allowed to do. So part of it was like, one of them was a award-winning photographer there. He's a journalist. He's like, I have a contract with a company in France, and I can't go. He got a contract with a company in France, and he's not allowed to go fulfill the contract to do the contract work that he wanted to do. So that's a reality. So for the Palestinian artists there, their reality is survival. Their reality is access to things. Their reality, you talk to a farmer, and the number one, you could be asking him about anything. Eventually, it will get to the fence that was built halfway through his land. You didn't even ask about it, but eventually the conversation will go there. That's their reality. That's who they are, and that's what they live. I was very interested in this panel just as an idea to hear that other side, to hear, the plight of the Israeli artist and what that means, and what does that mean for you? Like, what is that? I didn't even think about that perspective, which was very interesting and enlightening for me personally, to hear an Arab Israeli and the struggle of trying to separate those two, or not separate those two, or combine those two, and what outside forces are. So for me, that was my perspective on it, is I've seen both sides, really. I grew up in Queens, in Forest Hills, Queens, the most Jewish Israeli neighborhood in America. So I have that, and then I have, my Arab side, and then I have being able to see Palestinians in Palestine and talking to them about what they're dealing with. And for them, it's very real. A lot of the photos of the children that I've taken are orphans that are sponsored because, and then you get into why they're orphans. That's a reality. So So we take it from different perspectives. I find it personally very interesting when you say the shift in Israeli culture was that the radio got a little bit sad. The first thing that popped into my head is, well, in Gaza, the electricity wasn't there, so they didn't have radio and TV.
No,
So,
they had.
so what?
I can tell you for sure because they are getting their electricity from Israel, so they had.
Okay, but what is that psychological effect on the people? That's interesting to me. You know what I mean? So, I mean, that's a reality that sometimes we don't like to talk about, but.
Anyone would like to comment?
I want to go back to the comment about boycott and what I was starting to say about how it's going to affect many, many lives of human beings living in Israel, whether it is Palestinian, Arab Israeli, or just Israelis, Jewish Israelis. I feel like you take that one thing that make an Arab Israeli keep on doing what he's doing. Okay, it sounds terrible what I'm saying, but any human being, not necessarily Arab, not any human being, keep on doing what he's doing to sustain some sort of stability for his family. You take that away from him, like that financial key element that kind of sustained everybody. And if financially all the everything will collapse in Israel, I see that it's going to mainly escalate the situation into a terrible. Maybe I'm thinking only negatively about how it can all end up being, but I have a feeling that it's definitely not going to contribute some sort of solution, stabilization, end of the conflict. I have a feeling it's going to like a more severe war, if that's what is going to happen. It takes an art school to understand that.
Actually,
the question for the gentleman asked about non-political art.
Actually,
Yeah.
I'll answer that just from my perspective. I find it really ironic that we're talking about art and politics, and yet the entire conversation has been about politics. We have talked very little about the actual art. I don't know if anybody else has noticed that.
That's why I made sure to read the excerpt from the beginning.
But that's my perspective, is interestingly enough, we're coming here to talk about the art of the people, yet we're talking about the situation that the people are in, causing the art to be created or not. Art, in all honesty, art is created wherever you come from, wherever you live, your experiences. That's what will dictate. So there is no separation for me between political art and non-political art. Wherever you're raised and whatever your ideology and whatever your thought process is, you will create, good art will be created from an honest perspective. Where you come from and what you're raised and what you're creating honest work to you, because that's who you are and that's what you want to express. Same thing with you, same thing with everybody up here, I would hope. And for everybody in the audience, you want to create from an honest place. You don't want to create based on, I think I want to represent this, therefore I will create this. It won't be honest. But if you're creating from a position of honesty, your self-honesty, or searching for honesty, or any of those things, then you're creating from your experiences. Then a Palestinian artist, the goal is for one day for a Palestinian artist to create something and it not be considered political art, for it to be considered just art. For anyone to be, for a South African artist to create something and not be considered apartheid art, or art that was born out of apartheid. No, I'm sorry, they were there before the apartheid, so that's art that exists from the soul of that person. And hopefully, I don't know if we can shift the conversation, or if there's, but that's part of the funny part, is that I don't think there is a way for us to shift that conversation to be about the art without talking about all the issues. And I think that all your questions circled about politics. We're a bunch of artists up here. What do we got to do with politics?
Comment about the other questions?
I have a feeling that there's this, it's like we're pulling towards both directions. Where is the conversation shifting to? And I have a feeling like the maybe key topics that were like interesting to many of us were like the had to do with more descriptive facts of how does the conflict look like. For some of these people sitting in the audience, all they know is what they hear from the media, which is sometimes very much biased and sometimes very much just more of the same that you normally consume anyways. So I have a feeling that from my perspective, there is this gap between what's being said here about Israel being an apartheid. Is it an apartheid? I think that's something that I would like to hear more from the panelists.
Well, at least for me, a lot of the pieces here have either stories attached with them or very distinct reasons why that piece exists. And I think you can't separate the two. And I think just the way the format was kind of did that. For example, if you stop on that one, this is a Palestinian comedian who is doing a live show called Legally Homeless, because his actual he doesn't have a passport, so his actual legal standing is homeless. He is stateless. So his comedy routine was about being a homeless person. His whole tour was about being essentially homeless, considered homeless and stateless. And so the whole series and the photo series that we created was out of that. How do you express that? Well, we make him homeless and we have him sit out, and then, I don't know if you switch to the next one, I think he had a sign with him one time where we sat him out in the street and we had a sign that says, "We'll tell jokes for citizenship." You know, and people walking past him, and we just to see what people would react as. So that kind of thing. So for me at least, a lot of the stuff does need explaining, and I think with that context, I think the first one with the woman running with the flag, that was created the day that the UN acknowledged that Palestine is a state. So that was my expression. So it may appear cliche, but that's what I felt. It's on that day that somebody recognizes that you exist, you want to run in the street carrying the flag saying, "I do exist." That's the feeling.
Well, I've been speaking about my story specifically for over a decade, and as gentleman said there, I've spoken at Yale, Columbia, NYU, and many other universities, and I know it's successful when I go to a room and I read excerpts, and what seems to happen is that the entire room is moved, the entire room is outraged in a way by what they're hearing. Also, when pieces of mine are published and I'm getting responses, you know, when you hear that, or when you realize and acknowledge that your voice is actually being heard by whether it's a few people or, you know, more what you would hope to be the result, a larger group of people, that I think is where it's successful.
I think in that this is a good place to end. The panelists will be here. They'll be happy to speak to you. So please feel free to talk to them. But thank you very much for coming. Have a great evening. Happy holidays, to visiting a place rather than perhaps living in the place.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for having me. Well, a lot of this stuff that you're seeing here is a lot of my commercial work that before kind of finding my identity, I was, you know, working a lot in the music industry and in the film industry, and then getting to know other Arabs, other Muslims that are coming up in the same identity, trying to find your identity of who you are and how to represent yourself. So you kind of gravitate towards people that you know and people that you can relate to and people who are dealing with the same ideas as you are and the same difficulty as you are. So that was my first connection to Palestine, whereas dealing with other Arabs growing up here in America, kind of trying to find yourself, combining both sides to make a third thing that isn't really here nor there. What I ended up doing was I took a position at Islamic Relief USA, a nonprofit humanitarian organization, as their creative director. So actually getting to document the humanitarian side. So it was one end of my work is the entertainment end and the art end, and the other end was humanitarian work. And then it was bridging those together to kind of tell stories, really. Tell stories of people that we normally don't see, or we normally don't hear about, or we don't get to hear the truth about. So to search for that truth by telling their stories, by going and documenting the place and the people, and kind of communicating with the people directly to have them tell their story, and then bring that back here where people don't necessarily have that connection. So some of this stuff is in Jerusalem and the West Bank, and it's documenting a lot of the humanitarian work that we do in the organization, but also bridging that side with art to kind of tell people's stories and express what their plight is.
Thank you. Next, Brandy Bajalia is a multidisciplinary artist working primarily in the ephemeral installation and socially engaged performances. She often deals with her own complicated identity as a second-generation Palestinian American woman who grew up in the Deep South. Her projects have recently involved collaborative dialogue about issues such as the Gaza conflict while building a float made of flowers, utilizing art as both a form of catharsis and grounds for discussion. She was born in Alabama, but now she lives here in New York, and I would like to ask you, Brandy, you are an American, you were born here, but your work often deals with memory and your family history. Is distance, you find, a power or rather a limitation?
I don't think it's a limitation. I think it's a different perspective. For a really long time, I sort of wished that I had been able to visit Ramallah, which is where my grandmother is from, to sort of better understand the culture of my family and sort of what I've been exposed to my entire life. But I actually think, of course I would still like to visit, but I actually think that my understanding of it is sort of interesting because I have the sort of complicated part of being from Birmingham, Alabama, which has its own history. And then also growing up in a family that spoke Arabic around me and sort of exposed me to traditions that none of my friends were aware of. So I think I spent a lot of my life trying to understand what that meant and where I fit in. So I wouldn't say it's a limitation. I think it's, for me, I think it makes me someone who's really interested in the culture that I'm tied to, and then also like various other cultures as well, and seeing where, what it means to be from one place and to be exposed to an entirely different culture at the same time.
Thank you. Next we have Nouri Ilashi, a writer here in New York. She has an MFA in creative writing from the New School, and she's written for McSweeney's, the Huffington Post, the Fort Worth Star Telegram, and other publications. She received the Myborn Literary Nonfiction Prize. She's an advocate for her father. She will tell us more about that, for which she visits university campuses, among them Yale, Columbia, Brown, NYU. And she's now writing a memoir about her family. Noor, let me ask you, how does art help address your personal family history?
Thank you for introducing me. I wanted to start by reading an excerpt of my memoir, and I think that is going to be the beginning of the answer to your question. And it starts off like this. My family visited my father for the first time about a week after he entered the medium security prison in Seagoville, Texas. By the time I finally saw him, I felt like I'd finished a marathon. I parked the van and reminded my mother and siblings that our visitation time will end in 2 hours, so we hurried down the long cement pathway, glanced up at the towering barbed wire fence, entered through glass double doors, and filled out several sign-in sheets stating that we did not possess drugs or weapons. And we took off our shoes and placed our clear plastic bags of dollars and coins on the counter, walking through the metal detector in 5-second intervals. And then we stuck out our hands for a guard to stay.
Arab descent, but by the fact that they just moved to Israel, did this migration, they were expected to leave behind their cultural baggage, to their cultural ethnicity, and to take upon themselves this assimilated Israeli identity. So when I look backwards, I try to reverse my gaze. I try to kind of reclaim something that is left behind, something that I'm expected to forget, something that is not part of the how people define themselves in Israel, because like there is this barrier, I guess. So that's why I refer to when I mean Mizrahi. So Mizrahi is a generalized name for an ethnic group of people, but that are not the same group, that came from all over the Middle East. That's what it really supposed to represent.
And your work, how do you,
So in my work, in my recent work, I try to get this voice that is influenced or is present within me of Arab identity to come out, like on a literal level, but also on a metaphoric level. So I sing in some of my performances songs that are influenced mainly from Arab music. So it's Musica Mizrahit, which is music that is influenced by Arab or Middle East songs and music, and I bring it into my performances. It's there. That's how it sneaks in as a subcontext and a context.
Thank you, Eli. Our next panelist is Ridwan Adami. He was born in New York, but he's a Syrian-American filmmaker and photographer. He has done a number of photos and portraits that speak on the Palestinian plight, featuring Palestinian artists, writers, and other creative voices. He visited Palestine with the Islamic Relief USA, where he served as a creative director. He documented their humanitarian work as well as the issues Palestinians deal with in the West Bank through photos and video. And he's also heading Reed's Design, which is a creative agency. So I want to ask you, Ridwan, can you tell us a bit about the project that you did in Palestine? What made you do it? You did it during a visit to the place. To what extent, what is the role of an artist?
My name is Kati Halfin. I'm an organizer of the panel on art in the aftermath of the Gaza conflict. Thank you very much for coming tonight to listen to our panelists and participate in the discussion we have tonight. As the name of the panel suggests, we want to focus on how war and violent conflict impact art and culture, and the personal experiences of the artists who work and create within such an environment. I believe that our discussion here will contribute to deeper understanding of usually hidden details and nuances of life and work within such complicated, tense, and hostile atmosphere. I really hope that our modest event will be one of the small incremental steps toward the end of hostility, hatred, and violence between the people. I would like to thank Susan Ilian, my colleague, who unfortunately cannot be here tonight, but worked closely with me to organize this event. Also, I would like to thank Mark Tribe, who allowed this event happen, and I would like to introduce you Yoav Sivan, who is the moderator of the panel. Yoav Sivan, he is an Israeli journalist based in New York. Here.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Kati. Good evening, and thank you for being with us tonight. I also would like to wish happy holidays to everybody, and for those of us who celebrate today, happy Hanukkah. I'd like to thank the School of Visual Arts for hosting the event tonight as part of the Visiting Artist Lectures of the MFA Fine Arts program. A special thanks to Mark Tribe, the chair of the MFA Fine Art. Thank you, Mark. I'd like also to thank Kati Halfin for all the hard work she put into organizing the event and in making it happen. So before we start, just how many of you are SVA students? Okay, the majority. So let me ask you another question. Who has been to the Middle East? Okay. Who has been to Chicago, just to get like a comparison? Okay. So, and to Queens? Okay. So now we have the picture. So we're not dealing with art in Queens and politics in Queens. We'll deal with a bit of a more problematic area, the Middle East. It's always on the news, and usually it's not quite pleasant news, but tonight we're not talking about the harsh news of the Middle East, at least not directly. We gather here to speak about culture and about the connection between art and politics. So the discussion tonight we have 3 parts, more or less. We'll get to know our panelists, and then afterwards we'll open the debate for discussion. I'll ask a few questions to all of the participants, and we'll hopefully have a lively debate here. And we'll end with a dialogue with the audience. So we'll start. I'll introduce you first to Eli Barak. Oh, there are images. This is the multimedia part of the evening. Eli is a multidisciplinary artist. He works with mixed media installation, sculpture, and performance. He uses recycled materials in diverse surroundings. Eli engages with familiar cultural images in diverse spaces, creating a dialogue with curatorial practices. His subject is individual and cultural identity. He created group exhibitions, and his works can be found in international collections. He received his BFA in Israel from HaMidrasha School of Art, and he's also studied graphic design at NYU. He participated in the 2010 Israel Biennale, as well as in solo and group exhibitions in galleries in Israel. And he's recipient of the Excellence Award in Fine Arts from the American Israel Cultural Foundation. So Eli, I will to get to know you better, let me ask you a question. Some of your work deal with Mizrahi identity in Israel. Could you please tell us a bit, explain to us what is this Mizrahi identity and what is your art has to do with that?
Okay, so when I was trying to even explain to Katya how I view myself as an Israeli. It was really complicated. Up until the moment we actually got into this auditorium tonight, it was kind of tricky to explain how I define myself, because I see myself especially when American audience or people ask me, who are you? Of course I say I'm Israeli, but if I want to be more specific about my ethnicity or my identity, I say I am Jewish of Arab descent, because I think looking backwards to where my ancestors came from to Israel, all of them, without exclusion, came from Arab countries, Morocco, Egypt, Syria. So they're all